First of all, I'm very glad that this is a citizens forum, citizens manifesto. It's very important, and at the end of it, I will tie it down to why eventually it does end down. It is way beyond a problem that can be tackled by governments and laws. Eventually, it is about ownership of citizens. But let me start by saying that, you know, inclusive growth, we've had a fair bit of difference in experimentation over the last 25 years in the country. We are seeing different states emerge in very different ways. In fact, some of our breakout states in the country are Uttarakhand, Sikkim, Gujarat, etc. And they have all had very different trajectories. They have had growth, but they have also had reduction in poverty and reduction in poverty across demographic groups, okay? So it is not just about urban, it is also rural, it is not just a majority in terms of general population, it's also OBCs, SC/STs, etc., minorities and all. So it's important to understand that there is an ingredient, there is a recipe for inclusive growth, and some states have shown us that it is possible. Now, equitable growth or inclusive growth, there are fundamental aspirations of citizens, and that has to do with equality and opportunity. Eventually, as a government, the idea is to make available opportunities to people to grow. Outcomes cannot be ensured. I cannot make sure that if I give each of you the same treatment in this room, all of you will respond similarly to it. People will have different responses. So inequality in the long term is also something we should be acceptable towards. Inequality will remain, but what is an acceptable inequality is the debate that we should have here. What is an acceptable level of inequality? Towards that equality in opportunity, which means we should see considerable economic mobility. We should see people from the 5th quintile move to the 4th and 3rd and so on and so forth. People should do well in life. So mobility exactly has to do with, are these opportunities now becoming available? And towards that, the only recipes that governments can really do are provide infrastructure. That's why I will not discount the role of infrastructure. Infrastructure is fundamental to inclusive growth. We have had tremendous amount of research come from development literature globally, a lot of it from India, which says that when you give roads and electricity, you do have growth. And growth is not just about big 20 industrialists. Growth is about small micro enterprises, individuals with 2 cows. You can sell the milk, get to 4 cows, and so on and so forth. So that is growth. Second is infrastructure, also from the soft infrastructure sense. And that is one place where I think India, we have a lot to catch up. We have not made the early investment into human capital. Strong, powerful, fast-growing countries cannot be built on sick, dumb population. We need to have good investments, good reforms. We need to be able to put human capital at the center of our next stage of reforms. So we've done remarkably well, particularly in the last 5 years, in hard infrastructure, electricity, roads, ports, and everything else that you've heard of before. Human capital is where we are trying to make the push. And that's why Ayushman Bharat becomes very, very critical. Human capital involves education and health primarily. Now, let me give you a sense of, why, if you look at the diverse, the variations across the country, not only do you have regional and, in some sense, state-wise variation, we have a remarkable rural-urban variation as well, okay? One of the leading causes of that is we have to recognize that cities have become, it's not just states, a few cities have become the engines of growth in our country. And that's a good thing. The point is, how do you get Tier 3 and Tier 4 to also be able to emulate that, get the governance structure, have strong urban local body, invest in technology, bring industry, prosper, okay? So we have to recognize that engines of growth also have a certain recipe. We have to be willing to do that. And that is where the Smart Cities mission has been successful and has potential to be a lot more successful by attracting investments and leading to future prosperity. If you look at, I just want to give you one statistics, because this is all close to home and this is domestic crowd. If you look at health outcomes, wealth outcomes we have been closely capturing across the country for the last 25 years. If you look at health outcome, then the situation is actually not so great because, the top quintile in Uttar Pradesh, meaning the richest 20% of Uttar Pradesh, have child health outcomes which are actually worse than the bottom 20% of states like Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra. So the richest people in UP, their children are unhealthier than the poorest 20% people in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu. That has to tell us something about the nature of reforms required at the local level. We need to be able to put emphasis back on human capital. Okay? And that is again an emphasis why Ayushman Bharat becomes critical. The second point is, I think, since it is a citizens' manifesto, this is where I think one of the most remarkable legacy of NDA 2 will be Swachh Bharat. Swachh Bharat has managed to make a kickstart and actually a remarkable transition if you look at the numbers for something which I call culture of growth. It is really about discipline, it's about hygiene, it's about personal hygiene. And those are things which as economists we have traditionally discounted very heavily. But they amount in the long term remarkably important as far as productivity growth is concerned. So inclusive growth will require these kind of citizens manifesto. Swachh Bharat is something that we should be particularly proud of and sort of keep improving upon. But a lot of this has to do with mass movements. This has to go beyond a couple of states, a couple of cities, and some policies. And this is where I think moving forward, if we were to have a discussion on what can we do now, we have to make a distinction that, economic reforms 1.0 were essentially about the product market and trade, and we were liberalizing largely just from the product side. The factor side, land, labor, we have made some change. But we have to think hard about water, about issues like gender, again, going back to health and other issues. That is what economic reforms 2.0 will be about. We have to make a distinction between what is pro-business and what is pro-market. I think while we do have economic and social, we do have social and political right and left in this country, unfortunately, when it comes to economic policy, most of our experts are left and more left. We need to have a serious discussion on what is pro-market. Pro-market does not mean pro-business. Pro-market means more competition, because eventually, the more competition you have, the more the investments will be in terms of productivity enhancements or technological progress, more efficiency. Eventually, competition is good for citizens. It's good for consumers. And that's why competition is very important, and pro-market is in fact our effort towards economic reforms 2.0. Then I'd like to actually, just give you a sense of, because we're talking about the NPA, and I do fear that generally the common conversation, the public conversation does tend to get exaggerated. Towards that, if you look at the fundamentals of the economy, it is the fastest growing economy in the world. We have inflation under control. The fundamentals of the economy are quite solid. Okay? There are many factors, external factors, and in a long term, you will have to continually keep battling them and have best responses to those. But it is important to understand that engineering growth, as UPA 2 did, does have long-term costs. Okay? There is an organic way to grow, which is what you saw in the from 2000 onwards, right? Under NDA 1, you saw the initial reforms, where you saw fast, exponential growth for the first time. But after that, when you have this overheating and over-lending and this, what I call engineered growth, then the quality of the growth does suffer. And today, we are basically trying to clean up in terms of, if you look at this entire banking crisis. Now, it is not a peculiarly Indian problem. That's another thing I want to caution you about. In the US, after the financial crisis of 2008, they did have a program called the Troubled Assets Relief Program. So what was TARP all about? TARP in the US was about the Treasury, which is the finance ministry, working very closely with the central bank. And that's where I want to sort of re-emphasize the point that some of these problems, whether it is an NPA or overheating, is not the responsibility only of the executive, which is just the government alone. It does include a concerted effort, as you saw in cases of US. Well, in case of China, again, they had a banking crisis. There was a overheating and excess capacity getting created. Of course, in China, there is an embargo on discussions around economy. So we know what China wants us to know. So we do not have forensics of what is, but we can learn from the US. And the TARP program does tell us that Finance Ministry and RBI have to work very closely to manage expectations of producers and consumers and the global markets to basically highlight what the fundamentals of the economy are, which are quite solid. But beyond all of that, inclusive growth is not just the government's responsibility. It is definitely not about just entitling people through rights After all, the RTE Act, if it is anything, we know that acts that cannot, in fact, rights which cannot be enforced, you can get people into the school, but the quality of the schooling suffers. So rights will only go that far, okay? Eventually, it is about citizens. And that is what we must call now the culture of growth. We have to get disciplined. We have to invest in education and health and so on. And that's where the productivity growth and future inclusion will come from. Thank you.